Good evening and welcome to the latest lecture of the World War II Discussion Forum. I'm Gregory McNiff, the founder and executive director of the group. I'm thrilled to have Shawn tonight to speak on his book, Under the Red Banner, A History of the 43rd Guards Tank Brigade. Before I give him a formal intro, I just want to cover the usual housekeeping items. First, Shawn's graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker, or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will call on you to unmute line. Regardless, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking your questions. We'll take about 15 to 20 minutes of questions after prepared remarks and end about 9 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated. There's a donate tab on the website. Third, we do have a social media channel. It's on YouTube, and the icon to access it is at the top of the website. Email me if you can't see it, but hopefully it's pretty accessible. Fourth and finally, you can send any feedback through the website at wwiidf.org. Now, this evening's speaker, and someone I'm thrilled to have, I think I originally reached out almost a year ago to his publisher. Shawn Caza has a master's degree in Russian history from the University of Toronto. His thesis was on the conscription, mobilization, and training of Red Army personnel, 1935 to 1945. He has traveled extensively while serving in the Canadian Foreign Service from 1997 to 2019, and now lives in Ottawa, Canada. He has also published works on late Roman coinage, his other interests. This evening, Shawn will discuss his book, Under the Red Banner, The History of the 43rd Guards Tank Brigade, which traces the daily actions of the Soviet tank unit throughout World War II, including well-known battles, including Smolensk, Moscow, Operation Bagration and East Prussia, as well as some of the East Front's forgotten battles, such as Operation Mars, Orsha, and Vitebsk. I think I got that right. Thrilled to have him here. Unfortunately, the book has not been released, so while I can't read the reviews, I have no doubt they will be forthcoming. And with that, I will turn it over to Shawn.
Great, thanks. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm coming to you from wintry Ottawa, Canada, where my phone says it's currently -11 out there. So hopefully we're all warm tonight. Officially, I'm here to talk about my upcoming book, Under the Red Banner, History of the 43rd Guards Tank Brigade, 1940 to 45. So as Greg mentioned, it's still forthcoming. I'm currently going back and forth on a daily basis with my editor, tying up the last little bits. We had hoped to have it out by the end of the year. It's going to be sometime early next year. I don't know exactly when. It's published by Hellion and Company of the UK. The book covers the history of a Soviet armored unit throughout the Second World War. While the title emphasizes the unit's last and longest lasting incarnation, the 43rd Guards Tank Brigade, the unit actually went through 4 different incarnations through the war. You can see them here on the slide. It was formed before the war in Central Asia as the 9th Tank Division. It was redesignated the 104th Tank Division in early July 1941, just as it was reaching the front. This is a time when mechanized corps were being disbanded that most tank divisions had been under, and their tank divisions were being redesignated as the 100 series. So that's why it was basically given a new name. In early September 1941, its mauled remnants were redesignated the 145th Tank Brigade, as these much smaller tank brigades were introduced to allow for easier control by the less experienced officers, as well as simply reflecting the current tank shortages on the front. And finally, it was awarded its guard status in April 43. It actually had one more name change. It kept the number 43rd Guards, but at the end of 1944, it became a heavy tank brigade. But I'm not going to talk to you actually tonight much about the book itself, because that would frankly be a little boring. You can't condense a book of a couple hundred pages of daily details of a tank unit's actions in the war into a short talk. It would become kind of repetitive and such. So what I want to actually talk about tonight is why the book is important and what I think you can learn from it. And to do this, I'm going to discuss the historiography of the Eastern Front and how we get up to the point where my book comes out. As I'm sure you all know, history is the study of what happened, while historiography is the study of history and how it's written. In this case, what's the popular view of the war on the Eastern Front and how has it evolved? And boy, has it evolved. So we need to really start during the war itself. Our Western militaries, worked carefully to control the narrative of what was happening during the war, both for operational security as well as for morale and propaganda purposes. But this was done in the context of a free civilization. So official pronouncements and updates were demanded by the citizenry. Journalists were embedded in the military. Soldiers wrote home. Wounded returned to tell their tales. By contrast, Germany was our enemy and in effect inaccessible. Little other than Nazi propaganda trickled out to the West, at least outside military intelligence circles. In fact, I've read that even gathering German newspapers was considered quite a coup, operations conducted through Switzerland and the like. The Soviet Union during the war, was slightly more accessible than Germany as a theoretical ally, but in fact was little better. A tiny handful of Western diplomats and journalists, like BBC correspondent Alexander Worth or New York Times correspondent Harrison Salisbury, were permitted some highly controlled access. The Soviets' own media was state-run, highly controlled, and used exclusively for propaganda. Nevertheless, we know from their stories and their messaging that they fought an entirely different war from what we fought. That's the storyline given. For us in the West, the war began with the German and then Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939, followed by such things as the Battle of Britain, Battle of the Atlantic, North Africa, Italy, D-Day, drive across the Rhine. And though deadly, this is generally seen as a chivalrous war, at least in the early sort of literature and discussions of it. The Eastern Front, by contrast, was portrayed as barbarous and little understood sideshow. This is reflected in things such as the very title of the BBC's sort of first documentary series on it, The Unknown War. The Soviets, by contrast, had a very different view. Their war began with a treacherous German invasion in June 1941 against poor innocent Soviet Union. This is the result of a betrayal by the West. Somehow, the stories and explanations of this sort of vary. All other fronts were secondary. All the action was on the Eastern Front, and Soviet victory was inevitable after it recovered from its treachery. The true study of the war obviously only began after its end. But we get this interesting situation that shortly after the end of the war, the Soviets are already seen as a potential enemy. This is a fairly unique situation. I can't really think of another war where your ally has gone right after into the kind of suspicion and enemy category, or at least potential enemy. Also, surprisingly, the war is almost entirely neglected in the USSR after it. And that comes as a bit of a surprise for those that are very used to the later cult of the Great Patriotic War and the attention that this was given in the 70s and 80s of the Soviet Union and even in Russia today. But the fact is that right after the war, Stalin didn't want to dwell on the war, didn't want to dwell on the huge losses, and in particular, didn't want any questions raised about what had happened and how they'd come to that situation. So, for example, the massive number of sort of medals that were given out to Soviet veterans that people are very familiar with, there was nothing there in the 5th and 10th anniversary. There's no 1955 10th medal issued. These things began in the 20th anniversary, 25th, 30th, and so on. But the first while they were quite silent on the war experience in the USSR. By contrast, though the Germans were losers, they were available. They had lost the war, but we had access to them. And as the next conflict seemed likely to be against the Soviets, the German survivors had valuable insights to offer. Everyone's pretty well aware of the whole German military contribution to Nassau, how German scientists Werner von Braun and others were brought to the US to assist with the US space program and missile program. But there was a similar situation when it comes to military history. Around 2,000 German officers eventually worked for the US military, others for the UK military, and they produced over 2,000 documents and publications, largely through the Foreign Studies Branch, Special Studies Division of the US Office of the Chief of Military History. You can see a couple of their publications here. These ones were published in fairly large numbers. There's others that were much sort of more niche. I mean, German armored traffic control is pretty niche as it is, but these things were made for the US military in the post-war period. In addition to the military studies, which remained almost unknown to the public, several of the key German survivors published very popular memoirs, including Generals Guderian and von Manstein. Though undoubtedly all of these, both the military and the popular publications, had some military value, the works were heavily biased at the time. They created and spread many of the myths about the war on the Eastern Front that remain in widespread circulation even to today. So, for example, the German losses were not the Germans' fault. They were due to Hitler's bad leadership. They were due to the weather, the general winter theory, which, despite the fact that the cold and the weather affects both sides, and the fact that the well-known shortage of German winter equipment provided to the troops because of the view that maybe they would take Moscow quickly by the end of the year, had its own parallel on the Soviet side, not because of a lack of knowledge of winter coming, but because of the disruptions going on, the factories being moved and everything like that. But regardless of these realities, these myths were sort of perpetrated. The endless wave of Asiatic hordes that would simply overwhelm the Germans. All of this combined to defeat a well-trained and professional German military that was still at its best all through. That's kind of the line to say that's been perpetrated. In some cases, it goes further. The German military fought to save the West from the evils of communism. This is a preventative war, and don't ask us about war crimes. The eminent historian Robert Catino has noted that this is really the only war where the losers wrote history. By the 1970s, though, things are beginning to change. A new generation of historians, such as John Erickson, began to incorporate Soviet sources into their works in a serious manner for the first time. They were well aware of the Soviet biases. Nonetheless, though the material was still subject to serious censorship, there was a lot available, especially in this short-lived sort of Khrushchevite thaw period after Stalin's death. So in the early 60s, the Soviets were publishing a lot more. This allowed historians to start to fill in the details of the other side, which had been faceless and almost entirely devoid of details up to this point. And if you read anything about the Eastern Front published before, say, 1970, it's stunning about the lack of detail and specificity that you get on the Soviet troops. They don't even usually name armies, let alone anything below, unless we're dealing with something like a published picture that'll say, these are the troops of the 8th Guards Army in action. The actual narration of it is led by German accounts of the war that just talk about the Soviet forces they would face. So things like the work of Erickson and others began to fill this out with the Soviet sources. The available Soviet sources were still controlled, censored, whitewashed, and confused. Popular commanders, for example, like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Choikov, who wrote memoirs at this time, had no access to official records. So their accounts, even when drawn upon and sometimes taken as authoritative, were really mostly written from memory. Nevertheless, you could get more and more information this way. The Soviet authorities were still wanted to hide the real costs of the war and all areas of failure. So especially those by the top leadership. Enter U.S. Army Colonel David Glantz, an author that hopefully many of you are aware of. And just a disclosure that he was an advisor to my thesis 30 years ago, and I've been in touch with him periodically since. Colonel Glantz was the founder of the U.S. Army's Soviet Army Studies Office, now known as the Foreign Military Studies Office. And Glantz and his team began to mine any available Soviet material for lessons that could inform the West during a potential conflict with the USSR. So while the focus here was on the modern era, preparing for the Cold War, there was a heavy investment by him into World War II history. And this is because that's what Soviet military officers were trained on and what Soviet publications studied as they prepared for modern warfare. So an example of this is the often studied and feared Operational Maneuver Group, which were the heavy mechanized units of the Warsaw Pact that it was feared would invade Central Europe. the studies for this, for how it could operate, for lessons learned, were based on the World War II operations of tank corps and tank armies, especially in 44 and 45 when they were quite active. So you end up through Glantz's work in his unit with papers like the Leavenworth one shown here. These were published for a military audience, dealt with tactical and operational lessons, but are and were made available to the public. You got the Glantz area really began to flourish when actual Soviet and Russian archival sources became available in the relatively short-lived Yeltsin thaw, so primarily in the 90s here. At the same time that there was more and more access to the Soviet archives, a new generation of modern German authors were increasingly using official German archives as well. So the old accounts dominated by German generals that I spoke of earlier are now being questioned from both sides. You've got Russian accounts with more and more detail, and you've got more scholarly and properly researched German accounts. Some authors have referred to this almost as a pincer movement against history. Meanwhile, with Glasnost and Yeltsin era, Russian scholars began questioning how and why the Red Army had fared so poorly, especially in the first part of the war. And that period under Yeltsin, the sort of 90s, was really a rare time, the only time of East-West unity in World War II scholarship on the Eastern Front. As I'd mentioned beforehand, it was a very different take from the two sides. And since Putin has come in, it's also a very different take. But that was a time when scholars were both looking at the same sort of questions. You can just see here one of David Glantz's more popular novels, When Titans Clashed, which looks at basically the whole war as an excellent overview, and a more recent part of a huge 4-volume set, Barbarossa Derail, that's really just looking at a 1-month period in the early parts of the war. So he covers a huge range of stuff for those that don't know him. What was available at the time, though, even in this opening I talked of in the 90s, was still limited to high-level military orders and documentation. So you could get a fairly good detail of what was going on now at a front and army level, but not much below that. This is an example of the sort of greatest level of detail that was available at the time, a page from a huge 5-volume set called Combat Composition of the Soviet Army. And this was in the 1990s, this publication was my holy grail. This was sort of the best thing I could get a hold of to look at research and stuff. This page is from July 1941. This set goes through monthly entries, and you can see the structure of part of the Southwestern Front here at the time. Across the top, it's the Fifth Army, and we have listed there the rifle units, so the 15th Rifle Corps and the 2 divisions that were in it, and then the supporting elements, artillery units that were involved, armored and mechanized units, whether there's aviation assigned, large engineering units. But again, this is a very high level sort of activity. So you are fleshing out to a much greater extent than before what's gone on, but still very, very high. Nothing like what we have going on in the West, where things have always been very different. Histories of a division, generally based on archival material, have been common in the West for decades. One example, which is the subject of this forum in 2 weeks, I believe December 23rd, Mark Van El's Red Arrow Across the Pacific, the 32nd Infantry Division during World War II. So entire book dedicated to an infantry division. And I look forward to the talk. I'm sure it's an interesting book, but the idea of a study of a Western division is not unique. In fact, the level of access to records that we take for granted in the West can perhaps best be shown by this book on the other side. This is a history of the Swedish Armored Reconnaissance Platoon of the 11th SS Panzer Grenadier Division Nordland. So you've got a 368-page book on one platoon on the Eastern Front at a time when you're lucky to be able to pull together 1 page of detail on the entire war history of a Soviet division. So it just shows you, the differences we've been dealing with. So what's going on now? 2015, things changed drastically. Although sadly, this fact remains relatively unknown in the West. Not a lot of people are taking advantage of this. It's about 10 years ago that the Russian Ministry of Defense started a website called pamyatnaroda.ru, Memory of the People, and began making available for viewing and downloading literally millions of Soviet military documents, formerly secret and top secret documents, combat logs, reports, orders, maps, personnel records. All of this is available on the site. And this is an interesting and surprising development, as it did not occur at a time of East-West cooperation. In fact, by this time, 10 years ago, Russia's already well into its post-revisionist and national patriotic school of history, same place it is now, which is increasingly pushing forward simple hagiography, the unquestioning glorification of Russian side of events. Examination of Soviet mistakes and errors is increasingly frowned upon and potentially illegal under new laws enacted in Russia after the Ukraine invasion, which basically criminalize any criticism of the military in any way. You can see on this main page that not only can you sort of search for documents and begin to do your own research, but it does highlight favored pages or subjects. And so for the last year or more, it's had this Bitva za Donbass on it as its favored link, which is battle in the Donbass. So this is actually details of sort of 43 era, where the Red Army is liberating part of the Western Ukraine that uncoincidentally is the area that Russia invaded in 2022 and has been fighting for since. So even though this is a site that allows you to access old documents, it's still a site that is being slightly manipulated for propaganda purposes. And this raises a serious question of how long the level of access that I'm going to talk about or describe will last, especially if it's used for honest history like I'm trying to do here. As an aside, this site, Pamyat Narodu, is free to use and currently states that any use of material is freely authorized as long as it's properly noted as the source. This means that one can, like me, use this without any cooperation with the Russian Ministry of Defense or any money going to the Russian Ministry of Defense, which personally I think is very important. What can you find on Pamyat? Well, there's literally thousands of formally classified military maps, which then have unit positions and movement that have been uploaded and plotted on it. So you can search these by unit, by location, or by date. And it pretty well covers, as far as I can tell, almost the entire Eastern Front and the entire period there. This seems to have been made possible by manually tagging the location units onto the digital data of the maps. So anytime you see a unit here, somebody has somehow tagged that unit so that when you do your search function, you're brought to it. And if you search one unit like I had, you can follow its path, which show the orange lines there are showing you sort of a rough notion of the past from digital point to digital point. Errors do occur sometimes. I found this out and I describe in a little appendix at the end of my book how there were some, if you try and trace this unit through the war, you literally just off the site, there are some rabbit holes you go down where it's no longer the unit that's actually being described. But overall, it's quite manageable. Here we can see the position of my 43rd Guards Tank Brigade on the 29th of May, 1944. This view is a relative close-up already of a huge front level map that was once like a 4x4 foot thing all scanned in. But by moving the zoom bar on the left, you can zoom in or out. So this is the same view, the same map, zoomed down 2 levels. And you can see here the 43rd Guards Tank Brigade circled there. Is in the zone of the 121st Rifle Corps, concentrated at that date just north of a bend in the road leading to the village of Lopotici. It's 2 kilometers to the east of that village. As you can imagine, this functionality alone offers a huge increase in the level of detail available on the movement of the Red Army in the Second World War. So these maps could be used to compare to German military maps to see how accurate they were for their knowledge of Soviet units. It could be used to look at older Soviet or Western works and simply flesh out the details where once somebody described that a army was there, now we can look down and see all the various units that were in it. So this alone is a wonderful function. Of course, most of the millions of documents that are available for Pamyat are reports in one form or other, and they often contain their own maps. And when I talk of millions of documents, that's not pages, that's actually documents. So these range from one-page documents to 300-page documents. So I have no idea what the total page count on the site would be, but beyond what anyone could look at in a lifetime. Here you can see the first page of a report marked top secret in the upper right corner, copy number 1. This is Counterattack of the Western Front before Moscow, December 1941, volume 2. It's over 150 pages itself, published by the headquarters of the Western Front in 1942, which in itself is interesting. 1942, not a good year for the Red Army and the Western Front, but they're already packaging war experience and war documentation to be able to be used and studied for their advancement. On the right, just as an example, is one of the many maps that this document contains, showing the disposition of the 50th Army on the 15th of November 41, with Soviet positions in red, German positions in blue. These reports also often contain invaluable structural or organizational information. This is from the same volume. It's an organizational plan of the 24th Tank Corps, 14th of December, 1941. And while this type of structural detail or charting, this would be what we call a TOE, Table of Organization and Equipment in the West, or what they call a Stat or a schema, very common in the West, it's almost impossible to find on the Red Army from an authoritative source until recently. You know, it bears remembering that almost every work on Red Army organization and structure, including some published quite recently, are largely, if not totally, based on Western and German sources. So anything that says, you know, the order of battle of the Red Army, etc., you know, I'm not saying it's inaccurate. They are quite close when we compare it to things, but you know, they need to be taken with some grain of salt. They're based on, you know, not on official sources. The official sources here are hard to find and slowly being weeded out. But wonderful information. Why did I pick this unit I did for the book? So I just wanted to take advantage basically of the new resource. So I selected a Red Army unit with the intention of researching the entire war experience. So I wanted to select an armored unit. I knew that from the beginning, but instead of focusing on a unit that served primarily in the well-known mobile exploitation role, which they mentioned a little earlier was sort of the main focus of historians during the Cold War, studying the Soviet armored operations, trying to understand the threat from the Operational Maneuver Group, I chose a unit that was primarily played an infantry support role. This is what the Soviets called NPP. That was their acronym for infantry support tanks, because this is the role that half or more of the Soviet tanks actually played in the war, but is almost entirely neglected in research. I also wanted to select a unit that had played a role in some of what Colonel David Glantz called forgotten battles, operations which were concealed or at least neglected in official Soviet and post-Soviet histories, and that Dr. Glantz has been the lead at sort of describing and outing some of these, for example, Operation Mars and the Rzhev salient. I wanted to show what could be done regarding these, because it was easy for the Soviets to kind of hide or neglect the description of an operation at a high level when they're talking about what's going on. So if you're familiar with the Eastern Front and you start to ask yourself, what kind of happened in the Western strategic direction after the Battle of Moscow and before the Belarusian Operation Bagration in 44, you've got a 2.5-year period that's not really described much. And that's because the Soviets didn't want to go into the failures that went there at a high level. But when you get down to the strategic level and you're looking at any unit that was there, what was going on in any area at any given day, you can no longer hide that. That information is there. So the opportunity for us to shed the light on these hidden battles is sort of huge. So here we see, unlike the other general ones I was showing you earlier, these are some of the Pamiat pages that I specifically use. So this is one of literally thousands of pages I looked at from the combat log of the 43rd Guards Tank Brigade, in this case for April 1943. So we have details of orders received on the 16th and 17th of the month. The disposition of the subunits at 2300 hours on the 17th is described in great detail. So the 1st Tank Battalion is located in the woods 1.5 kilometers northeast of the village of Olhovka. We can see that the brigade, which was in a recovery phase at this time, this is between battles, received tanks, received new, well, not new, refurbished tanks, but 10 T-34s, a KV-2, 2 KV-1, 6 T-70s, 4 T-60s, in a delivery from Moscow on the 21st of April. Another 3 KV-1s, 10 T-34s, 3 T-70s, and 7 T-60s from a depot near Rzhev on May 1st. And we also get the note that 1 KV-1 and 1 T-34 had faulty drives, and a T-60 required a replacement motor. So this shows the incredible level of granularity that we can go to now on the Eastern Front. This is just from a few years ago. This availability is sort of stunning. On the right hand is a hand-drawn map from the log showing the brigade's march route to its new area of concentration that month. These records also include records, of course, during periods of combat. So here are a couple records covering fighting during the 3rd to 7th of September 1943 as part of the Smolensk offensive operation. And so the log will provide details such as the tanks are taking up position and where at 15:30 hours on the 3rd of September. They launched their attack at 18:30 hours. The hand-drawn map on the right shows the brigade's movement in red, German positions in blue, including retreats from both sides. So by combining the maps and the text of the combat logs, a high level of detail is revealed. So I used the narrative in the logs, plus these maps, plus the Army maps I showed you earlier, Google Earth maps and satellite images to get a real ground view of what it really looks like today, all to sort of figure out what's going on, because a simple translation of the log itself is often confusing and unclear. They're providing their information to the best of their detail, some of it's shorthand. You really need the maps and the other views to figure out what's going on. But still, the log will indicate things like here, the losses for the 3rd and 4th of September for the brigade itself. Knocked out 4 T-34s, a T-70, and a T-60. Killed 2 NCOs and enlisted. That was the personnel losses were classified by officer or NCO and enlisted. So that means 2 people overall. Wounded 2 officers and 3 NCOs and enlisted. And just as an aside, like I say, the information here was quite stunning. And it's not just interesting on this sort of tactical basis, but it also provided some really shocking insights. So for example, basically into the importance of the true records and being able to take this stuff and look at it in the historical detail. So if you used older sources, you could, the best sort of things you could get a hold of, you could discover that, say, in autumn 1943, in the battle near Orsha, the Germans, such and such unit, would be facing Soviet offensive. And part of that offensive would be the 43rd Tank Brigade or 43rd Guards Tank Brigade. And that was that. And so reading that, you're left with an impression, okay, this German division fought off successfully a Soviet tank brigade. Well, what is that? You could do some research, the basic tables, and discover that that's 45 to 50 tanks. Maybe you have done enough reading and you look through and say, well, I know they were under strength at that time, and I can see some details on how overall the group was, only at 2/3 strength or less. So you make an educated guess that you're dealing with 25 or 30 tanks, perhaps. And that's what it looks like when you look at kind of the maps and the information you have. But when you then get into the actual log and understand what's going on, you find out that at the start of that operation, this tank brigade, which had just come off several other ones, has 3 operational tanks, 2 of which are light tanks. One's a T-34. So this tank brigade that has been plotted on the map and that the German unit has fought off was actually a tank platoon and actually lasted for less than a day before it was, put out of combat. So this is the kind of sort of higher insights that some of this research, I think, can yield. So to add a bit to some of the conclusions I reached. First of all, being able to look at these detailed records throughout the whole life of a unit allowed for a level of investigation that's hitherto been impossible. By tracking what the unit did for the whole time, and literally I was keeping little counts on the side of what it was doing each day, but you could then put together what its actual war experience looked like. So in the case of this brigade, for example, we can see that it spent 34% of its time operational. That means at or around the front, 13% on operational preparation at or near the front. So preparing for combat or taking a short break from combat, but still there. 13% of the time in offensive combat, 8% in defensive operations. The remaining 66% of its war experience was non-operational, away from the front lines, rebuilding, training, etc. I go into a lot more detail on this in the book, in particular in the last chapter. The operational periods lasted between 8 and 73 days. So a lot of this information that we've kind of had to guess at can come out when you look at the real experience of a unit. In terms of losses, here, some shocking figures. We know that the average personnel size of this brigade was just over 1,000, despite its structural changes. It was never too far from that throughout the war. Irreplaceable losses, which is the Soviet accounting term for what we basically call KIA and MIA, killed in action, missing in action primarily, is just over 1,200. So we had about 120% permanent casualties. Replaceable, mainly WIA, wounded as well as illnesses, 2,500. So 250%. So you're looking at 370% personnel losses for this unit during the war. Armored vehicle losses, tank, and it did have self-propelled guns at times. You can see here, at any given time, although the structure changed, its official complement would be in the mid-40s to mid-60s number of tanks, usually around the mid-40s. So depending on which structure you're looking at, the 725 armored vehicle losses it suffered are 1,500% tank losses. So it went through its full tank complement 15 times during the war. Of these, 400% were irreplaceable. That's tanks destroyed, brewed up, burnt, or lost in enemy territory. 1,100% replaceable, damaged but not completely destroyed. And interestingly, this ratio actually matches that done by some other scholars looking at the entire armored component of the Red Army, 70-30 loss ratio, repairable, irreparable. The losses break down to 3.2 tanks per day of operational activity, or 5 to 6.5% of the maximum strength. So again, just sort of one example of what, beyond the extensive day-by-day narrative, I was able to draw out of these sources. At the end, I also, by looking at this particular unit and its experience, draw some conclusions, broader conclusions about Soviet armor and the use of Soviet armor. Certainly the unprecedented insight we get into the structure of the unit. So as I mentioned earlier, you can see the losses they suffer per day. And in each chapter, I have bar graphs. So you can look at the complement of what they're at for each report. So we can see how they trace over time. And you can see when they receive tanks, we get details of tanks that are repaired on a daily basis by their units. And then we also have details on the official structure. So this shows us overall or showed me that the Red Army kept changing and evolving its armor structure, even at the brigade level. I'm not talking here about the idea that where they added larger and larger functions, armored corps and tank armies that they were used for broader offensive, but just the idea of a tank brigade for infantry support changed frequently. It changed as they sought to find the best model. It changed as new models came in and as tank supplies altered. Um, and I'll just take a quick aside here to say that what tanks were in this unit, because I've been asked that. The short answer is all of them. And I'm not really kidding when I mention this. Over the period of the war and the various incarnations, pretty well every Soviet tank model and some foreign were in there. So as the 9th Tank Division, it supposedly had KV-1 and T-34 tanks. They weren't assigned yet. It had the OT-26 flamethrower tank, BT command tanks, T-26 light tanks. As it reached the front and became the 104th Tank Division, you had the KV-1 heavy and T-34 tank added, and the BT-2, BT-5, and BT-7 fast tanks, which were light tanks. By the time it became the 145th Tank Brigade, it received a KV-2, which it should never have had. It was never on the structure of a tank brigade, but it had one. And in fact, it had what is almost certainly, from my research, the last one. It still had one in operation until 27th of August, 1943, the last indication of an active KV-2. It had T-30, T-60, and T-70 light tanks, the T-30 being a very rare predecessor of the T-60. It had at least one Mark III Valentine, probably a Canadian production, Lend-Lease. It had two Panzer IIs used in its element. It had M3 Lee American light tanks. Again, none of these were supposed to be here. They were formally there. As the 43rd Guards Tank Brigade, it had Su-76s assigned to it. It had one lone T-34-85, which again is interesting, even to the end of 1944, when a lot of sources will have told us that the T-34-76 had been converted to the heavier T-34-85 well before. It's still running on T-34-76s during this time with one lone training tank. And then at the end of 44, when it becomes a heavy Guards heavy tank unit, it has Joseph Stalin II heavy tanks, ISU 152 and ISU 122 heavy self-propelled guns, M3A1 scout cars, the SU 57, which is a US half track, the T-48, the M15 self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, which again is a US T-28E on self-propelled. So a whole range of tanks, all in the history of this sort of one unit. So they never really had one model. And even when you looked at the sort of model or structure that was officially meant to be there for the time, when you look at any given unit, it's likely not matching that. And that's not just because of shortages, it's because of the sort of ad hoc nature of the whole supply element there. To other conclusions about armor on the front, tank brigades never had sufficient combat support elements to meet their needs. They therefore had to rely on the higher level formation that they were subordinated to for almost all of their reconnaissance, engineering, artillery, and infantry support. They would have small elements of this, except artillery, but very minimal. And this support was almost always insufficient or often entirely lacking. So that's a serious handicap, obviously. Overall, the Red Army made very poor use of the NPP infantry support tanks. They were assigned to rifle units. So that's the whole point of the NPP. But that means they were assigned to rifle unit commanders who have basically no combined arms training, not at the divisional and corps levels here. And that's pretty well shown by the experience here. And what's really surprising is they're assigned for very short periods of time. There's one case where the brigade was assigned to 3 different rifle divisions in a single day. At other times, a day or two is not uncommon. And of course, what this means is that the rifle commander who has received this rifle brigade for its support and who is responsible for ordering around and deploying it has a use it or lose it mentality. They have no vested interest in the long life or the life period of this unit. They're there to enact the orders with the rifle division that they were given from on high, which are probably pretty difficult anyway. And they want to take this tank formation and shove it in and get as much out of it as they can squeeze in the brief period they have it. That's obviously not conducive to the long survival or efficient use of a tank brigade. Higher level experts in armored warfare, so the chief of armored mechanized forces and their staff of corps, armies, and fronts, really had no say. Though the armored regulations of the time, including the 44 regulations, which have been well published and are accessible, talk about how they should be advising the infantry commanders in their use, really doesn't happen. They're simply supply officers supplying tanks to rifle units as requested, and that's it. Please don't give us any advice. Shut up and give us your tanks. Rifle unit commanders committed the tanks too early, used them piecemeal, and even though the idea is a brigade is sent to help the rifle unit, that's already much smaller than a tank division or corps. They're still supposed to use their tanks in fairly good groups, but they were put in piecemeal, used simply. Armor doctrine was ignored, reassigned too often. As I mentioned, limited recon and other stuff. And this led to something that I call in my conclusion, the grand pattern, because it occurs over and over again. You can pretty well map it out. The tank brigade is thrown into battle with little time to coordinate with the supported infantry or other unit that it's working with, and has no say in its orders. Poor preparation and insufficient reconnaissance fail to properly identify and locate German fire assets. Soviet artillery then routinely fails to suppress what German forces have been identified, especially German artillery and anti-tank guns, well hidden. German artillery, mortar, machine gun, fire, and anti-tank guns are then able to separate infantry from the tanks, the Soviet infantry from the tanks, forcing the infantry to go to ground or retreat and leaving the tanks abandoned. The brigade's tanks, now alone and isolated, took high losses for the anti-tank fire and or tank killer teams of German infantry that had not either been found by the reconnaissance or not been suppressed by the poor artillery. Therefore, the tanks have to retreat, can't hold any territory, the attack fails, the operation suffers. And this occurs in 41, and this occurs in 45, over and over and over again. And unfortunately, it's relatively rare that the brigade is able to get around and break out of this model. And it's not really the brigade's fault. It's the way that the brigade was used primarily. Another conclusion, high losses of infantry, the small motor infantry units that are with the tanks, but also tank crews, plus the Soviet policy where the survivors of a unit are removed before downtime. So when the brigade is taken out away from the front, the first thing that's done is the tanks that are still operational are left behind. They're transferred to another tank unit in the area, as are the crews. So what you get really is the officer corps, the staff, and the support elements are all that is sent to the rear to rebuild. This means that the brigade is actually always pretty well untrained or green. So the tank brigade crews in the East Prussian offensive operation in January and February 1945 are actually no more experienced than the tank crews in the summer of 1941. And this frequently the unit has to in fact Shanghai its own infantry to force in to make up for tank crew losses for all positions except the driver mechanics. So your tank commanders and tank gunners literally in some cases were infantry a few weeks beforehand. There were those successes to not only my brigade but to the use of these brigades itself. They survived. Their very survival in 41 against the German Blitzkrieg was a success. They were able to survive, keep harassing pressure on the Germans, and slowly attrit them. And more importantly, the brigade's own vehicle recovery and repair assets are nothing short of heroic. And I go through, because there's a lot of detail in the logs, so you can see frequently that without these assets, the brigade could never have lasted in an offensive more than a day or two. But it was the fact that they could, a lot of these tanks that were knocked out, whether it's mechanical breakdowns or minor combat damage, could be thrown in within a day or a few days. So the loss of the decrease in the strength of the tank unit was a relatively slow decline, allowing it to stay in battle for days or even over a week at a time, instead of, when you look at the actual loss numbers, this precipitous decrease. Instead, it would drop tremendously, and the next day there'd be more kicked in, and it would then survive. So that was an incredible success. And they didn't have a huge function. And this was not, again, the higher level repair functions at the rear that are getting a longer term flow. This is the brigade's actual small repair units. Finally, just before ending, a couple notes about my conclusion about this whole process, I guess, of research and writing this. There isn't, as I've mentioned, there's an incredible level of detail now available. We can fill in untold blanks on the Eastern Front. You could literally have a battalion of historians can work on the Eastern Front for the rest of their lives, and you won't scratch these millions and millions of documents, tens of millions of pages. We can corroborate or refute existing accounts. So, I would love to see teams looking into Prokhorovka or some of the more famous battles and really dissecting what we can learn from this. Errors are there, they're manageable. Um, Coverage is good, really good, but by no means complete. And I think there is a little bit of politics behind what's not there. A year or so ago, I was in the Military Historical Museum in Vienna, and the curator of armored vehicles there, they have a Su-100 Soviet self-propelled gun that was knocked out actually on the grounds of the museum, and it's still there. That has a bit of history to it. Supposedly the either the core unit commander's son was in that tank and was killed. And when um, the head of the tank museum told me this story, I thought, well, now that this information is available, let's look in and see if we can get more information on the activities of the unit that day. Extremely spotty. So, you can look at some good maps and get some elements and reports of what was going on in Vienna, but armored units and the Vienna operation, they're just not there. Whether they have just not been loaded up from time or whether there's some political decision about keeping them out, I don't know. But there's certainly enough, though, to keep people busy. And I guess this leads to my final point, which would be, how do we get a new generation of historians interested in this? Obviously, to fully exploit this, you need a bit of linguistic capability. My Russian is not perfect. I did use machine translation to help me with the masses, although I, understood a bit, but you need some skills, but we'd love to get the word out and get more people working on this. I think that's it, or at least I'll stop there and go to questions.
Thank you, Shawn. That was wonderful. Очень хорошо. Spasiba. Okay, there's a few questions in the queue. I'll take the first from Tom. Asks about, could you talk about what you learned in terms of matching the written summary reports to the maps? Were they drawn or developed by the same individual? Did they conflict? How much incremental data did you get by matching those two?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So the maps that were in the combat logs are drawn by the same staff officers that are doing the logs. And then you can get actually names in there, Major so-and-so and Captain so-and-so are doing the log, and then have a map a few pages later that lay out the operation. And those maps, it gels very well. And it's just the map can then give you a little more definition of what's going on, because they will sometimes in their narration, they'll leave a little bit out, but you can see from the map that they did go through such and such a town. The bigger maps that I mentioned, I showed some early on, the ones that are used for the plotting, those are maps generally by front or army level staff. And one thing I found with them is they are plotting, they're a little bit behind in their plotting. So you'll see a unit on there on, say, the 10th of July, and then when you read the actual unit record and look at it, it's moved on. It's a little past that. So they're playing catch up with those higher ones, but there were never any real cases of discrepancy with those. I mean, again, ignoring the modern plotted orange line, which just goes from point to point, but to actually look at where they were. Um, they're obviously spotty, a little spotty. I mean, good coverage, but every single staff map is not loaded up, so there are times where you can't rely on them. But it was quite good confidence, and I say the ones that are in the logs are the best by far.
Nice. Jadzia has a question, and then I'll go to Brandon, who has his hand raised. Fascinating discussion of these newly accessible sources. You made a brief mention of training on one of the last slides, and obviously the turnover was intense. But can you share anything else you know about the men, how they were trained, where they came from, were any of them Central Asian, or is the assumption that they were Slavs? Also, where do they end up at the close of the war, and do they occupy any territory? I feel like that's another thesis, but yeah.
Okay, yeah, great. No, another interesting question. At the beginning, they are Central Asian. At least a lot of the enlisted, especially the rifle, motor rifle battalion that's with them, they come up in, I think it's southern Uzbekistan and northern Turkmenistan area, around Merv, that they're brought in. A lot of the technical people and officers come from the towns around and are ethnically Russian. After that, there's unfortunately no ethnic information whatsoever. And there's actually very little information about where staff actually come from. There'll just be, a note that they're restocked. And often there's no information literally saying they're restocked. So you will just, the crews are gone, and then later on they're training, the tanks are going. So you have to assume that they have reacquired their people. In terms of training itself, there is a lot in the book. I go through because they give their training schedules in great detail. And I thought that that's something I'd never really seen before. So it is there. So, for example, if you want to see in the preparation before Bagration, the Belarusian operation, you can see the training and literally every subject that they put them through, how many hours or days they put them through, it's there. It's a very, very impressive training schedule in certainly the middle and later part of the war, which does not map out to the results, right?
Yeah.
So it tells me that I think they are trying, but it tells me that the quality of the people they're getting is not necessarily there. I mean, you're getting in the later part of the war, you're probably getting people brought back from recaptured territories that have been out, and you're running them through this training session. It's not necessarily sinking in.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Uh,
Sorry, the last part of that. Where
yeah.
do they end up? So the unit does end up just south of Kaliningrad now, or Königsberg, but it's pulled out. It doesn't participate in the last month because it takes a beating in the Brownsburg offensive operation, so it doesn't participate in the actual liberation of Königsberg. And that's a strange period for it as well, because it got a little mauled about a month before in East Prussia, and it gets rebuilt, this heavy tank brigade with only self-propelled guns, a regiment of Su-122s and a regiment of Su-152s in a completely unofficial structure that's not supposed to exist, but there they are, and they're thrown into battle once again, and they're kind of used as tanks, which isn't a great idea because self-propelled guns aren't tanks. There's a bit of a difference. So they end up the war about 30 or 40 kilometers east of Königsberg, licking their wounds, and they're quickly brought back. And what's kind of interesting is remnants of them end up forming part of the 4th Kantamarowski tank division that becomes the main parade division in Moscow that ran all the Red Square parades forevermore. It actually forms a nucleus of it. So instead of occupying, it goes back to Moscow and becomes a small part of that elite unit.
Excellent answer. I wanted to ask you, I know in your prepared remarks and the question you just answered, you seem to suggest the training methods weren't filtering to the results, but they must have. I mean, Operation Bagration, I mean, they clearly delivered a decisive blow there. I mean, were they learning first, the Germans, or evolving? Was it just attrition or resources? I mean, how did, they must have been doing something right at some point.
Yeah, I think that where the broader offensive is well planned and well staffed, vis-a-vis the number of Germans they're facing, then they're able to go and maintain their
Uh,
activity. So in Bagration, they do go quite well. They have many days of basically fighting for 50 kilometers straight in increments, battle after battle, and they maintain their strength fairly well. Then they get in and go through, liberate Mogilev, and then for the Minsk portion, they're back where the cauldrons of Germans are retreating, and they're able to capture literally over 1,000 German prisoners and stuff. But that's because the whole offensive was fairly well planned and run. And I think basically the same activities, the same level of planning and offensive they had in other operations, they simply ran into Germans that were too strong and too well planned for the whole offensive. So, I don't want to excuse them as a unit, but a lot of the time it really wasn't their fault. It's not based on their training or even their day-to-day actions in the overall outcome. It was part of the broader offensive that they were linked to tends to determine how well they did or not. Bagration and East Prussia are really the only two where they actually motor and make some substantial distance.
got it. And when you talk about planning, I mean, that's Vasilevsky and Zhukov, or who was responsible for that? You talk
I think personally, I'm thinking the smaller level for that. Their life is really influenced by the rifle division that they're assigned to. Sometimes they're assigned to a corps and the corps commander drops them down to division, sometimes to division. That level, they're the ones that are basically saying, they might beforehand say, our infantry are going to advance, and when we go 3 kilometers, we'll launch the tanks. And by the end of the first day, the infantry have gone 200 yards, and they're like, damn it, launch the tanks, help us out. And, without the planning, without the artillery support or anything, just get the tanks there. And that just gets them decimated.
Nice. Okay. Brandon, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks. Fascinating presentation. Explodes a lot of myths in my head. Um, Along those lines, and to follow up with some of the prior questions, basically you're saying that there's two types of tank divisions or formations. One is sort of the breakout ones for the big offensives, maybe they're the mailed fist to some degree, and then the other ones are like this, which uh, support the infantry and are in fact subservient to the infantry. So I was surprised to hear that, given that this is a guard, this has the label Guards Division, which probably means a totally different thing than I think it does. So if you could explain that to me, that where it was very common for these support divisions to become Guards divisions. I would have thought those were the ones that were involved in the big offensives doing the breakout kind of work. And your conclusions, especially the part where you say, like in 1944, 45, these guys are still largely untrained. Um, would those conclusions be very different if you were studying the more elite divisions, if you will, the ones that were doing the breaking out more commonly? Although this one you just indicated at 44, 45 actually did motor for 50 kilometers or whatever. But in general, are these two different divisions radically different in terms of their war experience? And
Right. Yeah. Okay. No, it's a good question. The Guards designation is really an award for service for achieving some results, and meant then to inspire others to achieve results. And almost every kind of unit could be granted that. The only exception where I think some of the Katyusha rocket units were called Guards from the beginning, but for everyone else, it would be an award. So it really didn't matter, for example, whether you were, in this case with tanks, for the infantry support versus the mobile exploitation element. Either one would start generally non-guards and could be promoted to guards, and you bit of extra pay, nice little badge for you. That's about it. I had found various references that said, oh, the unit structure is very different. That's not the case. I could find no difference in the structure of a guard's armored unit, really. There were minor differences in a guard's rifle unit that got a bit. So really being guards didn't change it. But yeah, you had the two broad types of rifle units, and basically, or sorry, of armored units. Basically, the smaller ones, generally the tank brigades that are assigned to infantry, they're meant to assist the infantry in making the penetration. Hopefully, somewhere along the line, one of the infantry units is successful, does the penetration, and then these other units, the armored corps, tank armies, would go through this gap and exploit, and not really have to do any initial fighting and go on. Were they as untrained in self? I I think so. They were bigger, broader. They were facing a different level of attrition, perhaps. Certainly, they weren't doing the day-to-day attrition. They would, be left in the back for a long time, have this mobile thing, and then face some battles. So they might have been a bit better, but I think there were still a lot of untrained ones in there. My hope going forward is to, because I've gathered a lot of the documents related to the Konyev's part of the Berlin operation. Zhukov's main drive with the first Belarusian front is quite well known, and most books on Berlin spend the majority of their time there. Konev to the south, with a couple of 4th and 3rd Guards tank armies, punches in, has much more success than Zhukov in terms of operation, and then he drives in and up and to the sort of southwest part of Berlin in the same time it takes Zhukov and the gang to battle up the Seelow Heights a short bit. And so that's what I would like to really look at next. And I think that would help, instead of one unit sort of tracing that whole activity on that part of the front. I hope that would reveal more of the kind of question you raised, because it's a very interesting one about, was everybody as poor state in 1945, or were there some that were still elite?
Thank you.
Shawn, do you have time for one or two more? There's a few more in the queue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect, thanks. Rose asks about, could you briefly compare the training tactics between the Soviet Army and the German tank divisions?
Training, eh? I don't know a lot about German tank division training, but certainly it would have been miles above what the Soviets were doing. During this period, when you look, if you go through the details I've got laid out, it really is basic training they're doing each time during the war. So you are starting with, can the crew drive? So many hours driving, so many hours learning how to lubricate your tank, advancing into how to, move across, shoot at a target, stationary moving, platoon training, some of this. The Germans would have left them in the dust in terms of the sort of training level, until you get to that late part of the war where the Germans themselves have got big problems. But yeah, it did surprise me, the level of training that they're able to do because of the amount of time that the units would spend in the rear during what you would think would be a desperate times, 42 and 43. But it's nothing like the sort of professional level training you see in the Germans.
Got it. And
A bit like the Russians today.
Brian asked about the archives and the resources. Is there something that has happened in the last decade or two that, you mentioned this overwhelming amount of resources? What's the current status, and why now? What's different or new relative to our previous understanding?
Yeah, a good question, because I say it certainly didn't come out of any interest in supplying the West with more documents or enhancing transparency and cooperation with us. I think this name of the site, Pamyat Narodu, memory of the people, and it was associated with at the same time, they were releasing information on veterans and being able to trace your family members and stuff. So I think they were doing it because they basically wanted, people to understand more about their own glorious history. Right. History of the war. Here's a lot more information. Let's look at it for patriotic purposes. But the fact that it's such large volume and so detailed, I think speaks to, behind that political element, I do think that there are some, serious professional historians in that archive that saw this as a great opportunity to, share on a real professional basis. So we've been able to benefit from what was probably a politically driven, yay, fatherland kind of initiative. because I say things have not got better, obviously, over those past 10 years. I mean, you're already after the initial Ukraine, 2015, you're already after the initial Ukraine offensives. So not a great time, but good time to look at the archives.
Got it. And I guess last question, this comes from Brian. Again, can you talk briefly about logistics, how they handled repairing the tanks?
Yeah, and one thing I do in the book is I have text boxes, sometimes a couple pages where there's an issue like that I've just, instead of going in the day-by-day text, you just need to flesh out, including things like how they ran their intelligence, their radio nets. So I do look at logistics, both I talk about the lowest level of logistics, so what the tank maintenance regimes were, which is quite interesting. These things, just as anyone who knows tanks, they're not going very far for very long before they need maintenance, starting with little and working all their way up. And then I look at the larger repair element that you're talking about here. There was a whole cascading series of repairs that you could get to. So the unit itself had, at various times, basically company to battalion strength technical services unit, and that would have repair vans. So the entire unit support element was fairly well motorized to be able to keep up with this unit. Even though it's not a mobile exploitation tank unit, still it's meant to move around and all that. So they had repair vans, workshop vans, they had tractors to tow the vehicles out. So the initial level and triage they could do. And a lot of unfortunately, the losses, very rarely do they record when the losses, definitely from a German, whether a mine or German shells and stuff, and when it could be a technical breakdown. So you'll just understand that this day, this many tanks are operational, and the next day, a couple have blown up and you're down to this many tanks. And so there's a delta in there that are things that are even broken down or minor damage. And so these would go back to the unit's own elements to repair. And then that was backed up by the logistical units of the larger formations that it was subordinated to. So the rifle divisions and corps didn't have anything, but they were part of a broader, whether it's an army or a front. And even if that army was a combined arms army, which is the term for like an infantry-led, rifle-led army, that would still have weapon repair, motor repair, tank repair units and workshops in the back. So I do go into, great detail. You can go back to those levels and further, all the way back to, front level workshops, rear workshops, which can still be, they're not necessarily the deep rear, but they're not even led by a front. They're led by the complete Army rear services elements. And so you would put the tanks would go further and further back. But once they got to that point, they would be out of the unit's command. So there are, like I say, there's times where at the end of a battle, all tanks that are operational go to your next door neighbor tank unit. All the ones that need repair go to the back. You go to the back somewhere else to sort of rest and start to recuperate and retrain. And then, like I had mentioned in that one excerpt, the tanks start flooding in. Moscow sends you a handful, a workshop at Rzhev sends you a handful, you steal a handful from the neighbors, and all of a sudden you're sort of staffed up. But there's a lot more detail in the book on this.
Oh, excellent. I think that's a great place to end the talk. Thank you again to our speaker for a great lecture and Q&A. Again, the book is Under the Red Banner, A History of the 43rd Guards Tank Brigade by Shawn Caza. Please join us next Tuesday evening, December 16th at 8 p.m. when historian Rachel Lance will discuss her book, Chamber Divers, The Untold Story of the D-Day Scientists Who Changed Special Operations Forever. And they probably did change the forces as well, which tells the previously classified story of the eccentric researchers, are there any other kind, who invented cutting-edge underwater science to lead the Allies to D-Day victory. Hopefully you can join us. Thank you again, Shawn, for joining us this evening. Really enjoyed the talk.
Sure.
Thank you for our audience. Have a good evening, everyone. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you, Shawn.